All right. And there she goes. She's right in the first frame. Hey, Artie, how you doing?
Hi, Sasha. It's so great to see you. I'm so excited to chat with
You
you.
too.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been so long since we've talked. Now she's distracting me.
So cute.
So, yeah, Artie, it's so good to see you again. It's been so long since we've actually gotten to talk face to face. We've been texting and stuff, but it's not the same. So, I'm really excited to see you. How have you been?
I've been really good. Yeah, it's been an intense year and change.
Yeah.
The battle over gender insanity continues apace, and it's kind of exhausting in some ways. And I kind of
Yeah,
just want it to
definitely.
be behind us, but there's still so much to do, and there's exciting progress being made. So it's trucking
Mm-hmm.
along.
Yeah, definitely. It is. I mean, things have definitely changed so much since we first talked. It's like it's gone from basically being this like really, really tiny niche underground feeling to now everybody's talking about it, and like everybody and their mother is talking about it. Everybody knows about it. Everybody makes pronoun jokes now, even if they're afraid to maybe go farther than that. But I mean, is that the sense you get like in Canada where it's just exploded now with everyone talking about it?
Yeah, very much. It's so intense. So it was about 4 years ago, I believe. It was right around the same time that COVID was
Mm,
just starting when
yeah.
I had started recording videos and putting them on YouTube. And when I created this Arty Morty Twitter account, and that's not my real name, I'm sure you could have figured that out. And in that time, yeah, everything's changed. It felt at the time like I was one of this very small number of people who had amassed enough sort of knowledge about the topic that I was trying to share it with the world, that everyone had gone in the wrong direction. And now there's still a surprisingly small number of people who have a kind of expertise knowledge base on the topic of gender and sex and this whole thing. And, not to be falsely modest, but like I think I have a strong expertise in that area. But there's a lot more demand for our expertise now. There's a lot more people starting to
Yes.
realize that this is not a cut and dry culture war left versus right issue, that it's not as easy as there's a bunch of deplorables who just don't understand and who just are so mean and it's homophobia 2.0, and then there's a bunch of nice decent people who just want progress to happen. This is suddenly that template which had worked so well for people. People are realizing that this issue doesn't fit that model. There's something wrong. And we can see people still trying to figure out how to move forward, what the new template's going to look like, because a lot of people just don't understand that how to move forward when it's not their comfort zone. Most people have this nice comfort zone, which is I'm a good, decent, progressive person. There's bad, ignorant monster people out there, the MAGA people, and issues just fall clean and simple on those sort of party lines. And now that they're starting to realize that this issue isn't that, it's making them very uncomfortable, and they don't know what easy template to reach for to replace that template. So there's a lot of work for us right now. Us people who have been shouting from the rooftops for years that there was a problem, that this issue was not your simple left versus right, uninformed versus informed. It's more complicated than that. Yeah, so it's a strange time we're in. People are less hateful towards me, um, and more curious, but still very cautious and scared. I would say 2 years ago, I was scared to go to a gay bar. I used to work in the gay village. I used to be a bartender at
Yeah.
the gay community. I was strongly involved in the gay community. And after I started speaking up online, I was turned into such a pariah that I was scared to even walk down the main drag of the village. And now I can take baby steps into gay bars. And once in a while, on a quieter night of the week, I'll go and pop into, the leather bar and say hi to a few old acquaintances. And there's cautious friendship again. It's very, very, very cautious. So the sense was before, you're an evil bigot, you're on the wrong side, we hate you, get away. Now it's more like, okay, I still don't understand you. But what you're saying is not necessarily evil, it's just confusing, if that
Okay,
makes sense.
wow. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's so, I was looking at your YouTube channel before we talked to refresh my memory of what you were doing as well those 4 years ago. And some of your earliest videos, it was exactly what you're saying right now. You were explaining with the expertise that you have as a gay man who understands these issues very well and has understood them for a lot longer than the mainstream, if they even get it to this point, like you said. And you're explaining about how there are different pathways to trans identity, like all these different pathways depending who the demographic is, who the individual is. And it's such an explainer course for people who just might not know it at all. And you talk about how when there was the gay rights movement, the villains were these fundamentalist religious people who just couldn't accept that gay people just had the basic right to be who they wanted to be with, whereas now the villains are all these very rational, sane, I mean, some, of course, there are rational, sane, religious people, but, these feminists and gay people and scientific organizations, scientific knowledge itself is the villain to trans ideology, right? So, yeah, and then all those issues are being talked about more, but you still have people going like, okay, what's autogynephilia, the fetish that a lot of, for people listening who maybe have that question, the fetish that some men have where they want to be women, and that's one pathway to trans. So yeah, it's just crazy how all these issues have all these aspects of it. I feel like back then, a lot of us who were gender critical, almost it felt like we were driving ourselves crazy trying to explain these issues to people. And I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like that has changed, that dynamic has changed so much. Tell me how you feel about that when it comes to explaining these issues. I really feel like the pressure has gone down so much, and I don't really, maybe it's also has to do with like my personal arc of being canceled and then kind of just how I changed as a person based on all that. But yeah, I kind of feel like the explaining time is almost over, maybe. But I don't know. What do you think about that? Like the whole like explaining the ins and outs of it. Like, well, there's this, and then there's like all these little details and things about it.
Oh my God, the pressure has gone down is exactly right. I could not possibly put it better. There's still some pressure, but at the first there was so much pressure. I'm not the right person in the sense. Like, I'm not by nature a contrarian. I'm not by nature someone who likes to have difficult opinions. I'm not by nature someone who stands out from the crowd in that sense. But I am principled by nature, and if I disagree with something, I will say so very clearly. So this issue, there was so much pressure to get in line with the crowd. There was so much pressure to keep your head down and your mouth shut, that trans is just gay 2.0 and there's no problem here, and trans women are just women, and there's just nothing to see here, and give all the surgeries to all the people who say they want them. The pressure was so much I was cracking, like it took a serious toll on my mental health. But now I feel like there's still more work to do to educate, but there's at least we've got to the point where people know that they need to know something. It was an unknown. People didn't even know that they didn't know all this stuff, that they were missing all this information. And now at least people know that there's more to learn. Now people know that they should be asking questions about like what trans is. So I find myself interested in I find it interesting the kinds of things I'm interested in trying to educate people about now. I still think, first and foremost, autogynephilia, the concept, is the number one thing that will sort of make everyone finally understand what trans is, so to speak. But I've found myself a lot more interested in neuroscience and biology and explaining what homosexuality is and what gender nonconformity is from a scientific perspective. I think getting a very baseline crash course in neuroscience and in evolutionary biology, like why a certain percentage of humans are homosexual as opposed to heterosexual and what causes that, helps people to understand that there's a sort of baseline material reality of homosexuality. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of cultural discourse. It's a hard, cold, material component of the human condition. And then we can talk about gender expression and the sort of the reasons there are feminine males and masculine males and feminine females and masculine females. And then we can talk about how trans doesn't fit that model. So we need to establish that there are some very firm material biological components to homosexuality and to gender, into a broad spectrum of gender expression. But transgender is a label that doesn't fit that model. It's something else. And then we can start getting into the reasons that these very disparate, it's one of those words I never pronounce right, but I read all the time. So everyone in the comments can make fun of me because I got it wrong. But, there's different reasons that different groups of people come into the very modern, postmodern concept of transgender identity. I think once people get the grounding in that, that would really help us to move forward, So that's something I want to try to focus on a little bit more, teaching people some very basic sort of science about homosexuality. It's very real, it's very material, it's very rooted in, what goes on in the fetus, in utero, and transgender is not that. It's a different thing. So that's something I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in educating people about the tribal nature of humans. So much of this fight is a meta fight. It's about the fight itself. It's teaching people that they're trapped in culture war dynamics, that so many times they refuse to absorb and accept very basic, obvious statements of fact because of their loyalty to their in-groups and their fear and anger at out-groups. So I think we all need to take a crash course in tribalism and how tribalism affects the human brain. Actually, I think that's maybe the number one thing, because we're now in the information age and in the information overload age. And you could probably argue that this whole mess has to do with people losing their trust networks, that there are kind of alternative realities in the world. There are entire circles of people who just watch Fox News and live in like their own separate realities. And our oppositional reality to that is also getting infected with fake news now and false information. And nobody knows what to trust. Nobody knows what's real or not. We have to teach ourselves that we're tribal primates first and foremost. And we have a natural instinct to disbelieve anything that we sense comes from the other tribe and to cling on to everything that comes from our own tribe. And we have to learn to build better trust networks. We can't just learn to get over trust networks. We have to build better ones. So that's something I want to work on, too. That's a very North American way of looking at it. We're seeing this battle shift into North America. 4 years ago, almost all of the action was in the United Kingdom, which is a very different country. It's more secular. It's less tribalistically divided along culture war lines. In North America, the sort of tribal, we will never trust the other side kind of system is much more prominent, so we have to focus on that more. Yeah, sorry, that was a long rant.
That is true. No, that's so true. I mean, in the US, it's like either you are in the basket of deplorables, according to the Democrats, or you think the Democrats are a basket of deplorables. So it's so polarized, and it hasn't gotten better, I don't think. If anything, it's probably gotten worse. Although, I mean, there are, people you talk to who are independents and things like that. But in terms of the issue of people kind of needing to cling to their tribe, and I like how you said we can't just get rid of that. That's just always going to be with us, because it can feel a little frustrating, but then you remember that, like, it's you too, so we're all part of that. This was actually kind of leading me right into something super controversial within the gender critical world, so why not just go there? There was recently this clip that circulated on Twitter of Kelly J, so Posey Parker, big British commentator woman who has a very, large voice, large platform. And she was saying that she actually thinks that you should be legally allowed to discriminate against trans people when it comes to housing and employment. Did you happen to see that video, Arty?
I didn't, but
okay.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess, but what I want to ask you about is not just like, oh, should they be allowed to? Because I feel like that's going a little far, going a little too far in that direction, in that right-wing direction. However, what I am curious about, or sort of interested in that question, in the questions that came up from that, was the question of gender nonconformity versus trans identity. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, there's definitely an overlap, but there's also a distinction. And I've been talking to some people recently so Jamie Reed and Erin Kimberly, who were both sort of blew the whistle on working in either youth gender clinics or in with young people who were transitioning. And so they talked about that there's the gender nonconformity, but then there's also like the body distress. So I noticed there's a real dichotomy there. There's two different things. There's people who have serious distress with their bodies, and then there are people who don't necessarily have the distress isn't coming from within, it's coming from the society around them. So maybe you can kind of just shed some light on that or explain a little more, like gender nonconformity versus trans identity. Where do we, how do we parse
Right.
that?
Well, an identity is an interface between an individual and the culture that they're in. An identity is not something that is genetically infused with your body. An identity is a social construct. And a social construct has to do with how you fit into your socially constructed social landscapes. So it's an interface. It's how you frame yourself in that metaphorical world we live in called society. So if you don't fit the stereotypes of the different roles that are available to people in society, or if you fit into one that doesn't feel comfortable to you, if you look as though you should be treated like this type of person, but you feel personality wise that you don't like where you're being sort of how you're being assumed to fit into society based on your physical appearance or your gender expression, that can lead to distress. So that's when people sort of create these identities for themselves. They assert, I have a gender identity, or I have or I am a transgender person. They're trying to say the way I'm being sort of slotted into a social role isn't where I want to be. And that can be very distressing. And that can manifest itself as hatred of how you appear, because how you appear is why you're being slotted. If you're a teenage girl and you're developing breasts, you might not like that you're being more sexualized in the eyes of men than you want to be. And you might not like that there can be subtle and not so subtle sexism being uh, directed at you because of your female body. So you might direct anger and frustration at your female sex traits because they are positioning you in the social landscape in a place where you don't want to be. So that can be one way. And another one, so it can be gender distress or it can be body distress. Often they're very interconnected because they both have to do with trying to fit yourself into society at large. And I don't think I think we have to understand that when people are in distress about their gender expression or about their body, this is a social problem. This says that there's something wrong with society, that there are people who are not just perfectly comfortable naturally sliding into society. And that's not that those people are bad people and should be discriminated against. It's that there's something that's not being accounted for in society. There are people whose needs aren't being naturally met. So I'm very sympathetic to people who are distressed about gender nonconformity. I'm very sympathetic to people who feel deep discomfort within their bodies. It's not that they're bad people or they're getting something wrong. It's that they're unhappy with something that's going on within our Western culture. Does that help explain it all? I'm not sure if I.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's such a difference between, as I see it, as I've started to come to understand it, there's such a difference between people who have, that sense where it's like they're okay, or maybe they would be okay with who they were if they could be accepted. Like, I recently interviewed this young man, and it was a terribly tragic story because he
Mm,
went through vaginoplasty, he went through medical transition, and then he regretted it, and he regretted the vaginoplasty immediately, upon waking up,
that's
and
horrible.
he
Yeah.
isn't the first person I've heard say that. And so now he's back to, as he says it, living as a man, and he never really wanted to be a woman. He's a gay man, and he grew up in Poland with
Mm.
a homophobic environment around him that made him feel so much shame for being gay. He said even into his 20s, hearing people say nasty remarks about gay men would drive him back into the closet, as he said it, and make him feel just disgusted with himself. So he
Mm.
was coming at it from that perspective, which is a totally different entry point than someone who is like starts off as being like, I hate my genitalia, I want the body of the opposite sex. It's so different, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And then in terms of the whole discrimination thing, like, oh, an employer shouldn't have to hire someone who's trans. How do you know if I mean, is it just because of the self-declaration? Like, how do you know if someone is trans versus if they're just gender non-conforming? How do you know if they're in that camp versus just, gender non-conforming? Like,
Yeah.
how is that part even
And you can't
differentiated?
go back. Like, you have to understand that, like, people can't go back on these things necessarily very easily. Somebody who has a trans identity, you can't really make any judgment about them. It's a lot like religion in that sense. I have my beefs with some of the tenets of Islam, say, and I'm critical of,
Yeah.
in a sort of like in an abstract sense, tenets of all kinds of religions, and I will criticize religions freely. But people who have religious identities, that doesn't tell me anything about them. I happen to really, really like many, many, many Muslim people, and that's very different than my sort of abstract conceptual criticisms of, the writings within the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't make any assumption. If somebody tells you they're Muslim, you don't know what their views are on any one individual thing. You don't know why they identify as Muslim. They could do it because it's part of their family tradition. They could do it because, like you can't get anything out of someone by just knowing what religion they adhere to. And that's the same with transgender identity. You can't just say, oh, you have a transgender identity, you must believe XYZ. There are people who have transgender identities who fully, fully comprehend that sex is dimorphic, who comprehend that they are the sex that they are. Some of them maybe even are sort of post-operative regretters who don't believe in anything to do with gender identity ideology anymore, but they've had the sex change operations. They visibly look much more like the opposite sex than the sex that they are. And there might be political reasons to hold on to a transgender identity. They might be trying to work with people who have transgender identities and to convince them to get better therapy and better treatment. And it might be easier to reach those people by holding a transgender identity oneself. Does that make sense? So the idea that we can just discriminate against someone because they hold an identity is just going entirely the wrong direction. And also, that's ascribing a lot of weight to transgender identity. I would think the broader principle here is that we're supposed to say identities shouldn't figure so strongly within our legal framework because they're just identities. You know what I mean? What
Mm-hmm.
matters is the material facts of what you've done in your life, your actions, and the body you have, and these kinds of things. These material things that are measurable, those can work their way into the legal system. You can build frameworks of rights and responsibilities around those things. But a self-declared identity, you can't, and that works both ways. That means you shouldn't get special privileges for having a self-declared identity. You shouldn't be discriminated against either. So, to anybody who says that you should have the right to discriminate against anyone for simply holding a transgender identity, I would say that's going entirely in the wrong direction. You know?
Yeah, and that's such a good point about like you don't know what the the person themselves is like. You don't know who they are as a person or what brought them to where they are. Their entire story, what they'll be like to work with, you have no idea. And there was something else you said. Sorry, what did you say right after that? You said you can't. It's like the religion. You don't know that who the individual might be, and then you said about the identity of be. Oh, okay. You made a really good point that it's kind of making the identity of trans even stronger. So it's like backing up that the concept that there is a defined group of people who are trans who are somehow separate from the rest of the population. That's a great point. I didn't even think of that.
Right, where some people say, like, gender doesn't even exist, and I don't use that wording myself because it can mean different things to different people. But transgender is just an identity label. We're supposed to be diminishing it in significance, yeah, by saying we should actually be using it as a criterion for discriminating against people is elevating it and not bringing it down. You're elevating
Yeah.
it above someone's sex instead of bringing it down below someone's sex.
Good point. Good point. And it's also kind of elevating it on an individual level, because if you, instead of turning someone away for saying that they're trans, if you just evaluated them based on their individual character and then welcomed them into a different environment that's not the trans cults, then maybe they would start, maybe, who knows, maybe the ideological hold on them would start to loosen as well. So like you
Yeah,
said,
I,
it's not a good way of, obviously, it's not a good way of reaching people.
no, but I can understand that probably a lot of that anger and frustration comes from that other cohort of people who are opting to take on transgender identities and who are playing with their pronouns and who don't necessarily have a ton of distress, who are much more interested in gaining opportunities through transgender identities. These are people who are autogynephilic, although not all autogynephilic people fit into this group. There are some people who are just obviously chancers, who are taking advantage of people's naivety to walk around in women's changing rooms undressed and to watch women get undressed and to bully women and things like that. So there's a lot of anger and frustration about that, and that's very, very understandable. But yeah, sometimes the rhetoric in response to that can just get the nuance gets completely lost, and decent people who just are struggling with body issues and identity issues, who don't want to get involved in all of that, and who don't want to step on people's toes, can face splashback, which isn't good. And that goes back to what we were saying 4 years ago when we all started talking about this. We were saying there was a risk that there would be a backlash against gays and lesbians and bisexuals, and that there would be a backlash against transgender and transsexual people who are just trying to, and gender nonconforming people and gender dysphoric people who are just trying to get on with their lives. And this is what it looks like. It looks like people saying
Yeah.
things like we should be free to discriminate against anyone with a transgender identity. And the rhetoric against gay people has gone explosively through the roof. And that's
Yeah.
within the quote unquote gender critical scene as well. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot more open anger at gay males coming from feminists, that it's just like it's coming from that part of the scene, not just from the basket of deplorables. There are a lot of
Yeah.
people who are so angry at the situation that there's just a total, there's a lot more hostility towards gay men. And it's really been upsetting to me. Like I spend a lot less time on Twitter now just because there are so many people whose names I recognize as prominent figures within within who have been speaking about the gender mess, who are starting to really dip their toes into some really ugly rhetoric against homosexuals and bisexuals and just gender nonconforming people. And that's very
Mm-hmm.
upsetting. We don't want that.
Yeah, 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 definitely. I mean, I think, and I've seen it too for sure. And I feel like if I was an employer, I would think of it like this. If someone comes into an interview and it's a guy in skimpy, unprofessional clothing and high heels and a big old wig and, like, just looking ridiculous and unprofessional, like in the way that you would also judge a woman as looking unprofessional if she showed
Yeah.
up to a interview like that, and they're saying like, oh yeah, and I'm gonna use the women's bathroom, blah blah blah, call me ma'am, that's not someone I would want to work with. However, if it was someone who was like Erin Kimberly, who is just not like that, just completely on the other end of the spectrum from that, and
Right.
Erin just happens to be different than, happens to be medicalized, a medicalized butch lesbian. That's how she describes herself now. So she's kind of like moved on from the trans label. But anyway, I mean, just so a woman with a beard, and that's unusual, and that's not something you see every day, but it seems to me very obvious that that would be a really nasty form of discrimination, whereas like saying no to the creepy guy is basic. But I think the is basic common sense maybe for me, but where a lot of these gender critical feminists have gone, I feel like maybe they feel like they were taken in by that figure of the guy, like the really overtly, like, aggressively woman presenting guy who's like, I'm a woman. And they always seem to be, when I was in college, like, they always seem to be surrounded by a clique of women, like fans almost. And
Hmm.
I wonder if a lot of women kind of felt like they were really taken in by that. And then they're now personally defensive of anybody who is, of all men who don't fit the masculine stereotype. Do you think that plays into it at all? Like this personal feeling of like they've been had, so now they have to
Yeah.
be on guard?
I think that's a really great way of looking at it. I think it's really interesting to look at this emerging, it's not entirely new, but it's certainly growing, this reaction among people who are critical of gender ideology against gender nonconforming presentation. Erin Kimberly, who, identified as a trans man for 2 decades, is a female who has very masculine characteristics from having taken testosterone for 20 years. Erin Kimberly calls herself a bearded lesbian now. She's like, I'm
Yeah.
female, I'm a bearded lesbian. And she gets attacked for that. And you would
Mm-hmm.
think, 4 years ago, the rhetoric was, look, if you acknowledge that you're female, you acknowledge your sex, dress however you please, look however you like, live your best life, everything's fine. We're all being honest about our sex. That's shifted. We've lost a lot of that ground. And it's interesting to look at what's going on. It's obviously a reaction, against, it's a reaction that people don't trust. They don't trust their senses anymore. They can't just look at someone and trust that they're male or female. But what people are trying to say is they want that to be disallowed now. There are people who don't even realize when they say, I'm angry at you, Erin Kimberly, for being a bearded lesbian and you should shave your beard. What they're advocating for is females should no longer be allowed to grow facial hair. Females should be legally allowed to be discriminated against in the workplace for having facial hair. They don't
Mm-hmm.
even quite realize that what they're stepping into is setting up that there are certain styles of presentation that are deeply connected to one's biological sex. And if, the same thing with, men wearing dresses and things like that. That caused a massive eruption a year ago when a man wore a
Yeah.
dress. And it was like, that was very interesting because I could understand that people visibly could see that was a female tagged garment of clothing on a male. It wasn't actually physically, it wasn't revealing at all. It was a very covering article of clothing. But because it was so jarringly not connected to the sex of the person wearing it, that just created this eruption of how dare. And I don't think people are kind of thinking through the logic there that says, okay, now you're saying that clothing is sex based and you must not, you're saying that we should be enforcing rules around sex, not just around appropriateness that is sex neutral. You know, I thought we were working towards a world where, there would be like dress codes that were sex neutral, that whatever is appropriate for a male to wear is appropriate for a female to wear, et cetera, et cetera. And whatever is inappropriate for a male to wear is inappropriate for a female to wear. But we're starting to see that it's a little more complicated than that. That there are some things that we don't want to see males wearing in certain environments that would still be okay for females to wear, and vice versa. That's a really interesting area to explore. I don't want to have a knee jerk reaction one way or the other because I can sense that there are some real strong feelings there, that there's something underlying that's going on. That I don't think we should I don't think I'm ready to adjudicate that, okay, I think these people are completely wrong, or I think these people are completely wrong. I think there's such strong emotion there, and there's obviously more to unpack that we have to look into, if that makes sense.
It
Um,
does, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel similarly to you in the sense that when I first got into this whole fight, I was so staunchly progressive and like men should be able to be feminine and wear whatever they want in dresses. And I think I have become a little bit more cautious now about that. And, like you said, I also don't feel comfortable like coming down really hard on either side. I kind of don't know exactly because I don't know exactly what that means or what's behind it. Like with Phil Illy, I think who you were referencing, the
Yeah.
guy in the dress, in the blue dress, who caused such an uproar at the end of last year.
And
And
it's
I
so
talked,
funny. I just want to jump in for a
please.
second because I stayed out of that whole thing. I didn't go to that conference. I only maybe interacted with that person once or twice on Twitter. I've never met this person. So many people tried to drag me into that dispute.
Hmm.
Endlessly people trying to drag me into it because I had gotten into some scandal about defending autogynephilia a couple years prior. People just desperately wanted to get me into it. And now that it's
Hmm.
a year past the Phil Illy dress situation, I'm happy to comment lightly about it. And to basically say, look, this drama on both sides here, that I'm not going to jump in on either side. But it's funny that here I am finally addressing it, everybody. Sorry, go on.
The headline: Arty Morty finally addresses Phil Illy controversy. Gen Spect Gate, or what was it called? Dress Gate? AGP Gate, I think.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. And do you feel like, have you, ha, how has your sense of being within the GC community changed or shifted? Has it changed or shifted over the past couple years? You've been so attacked, like you mentioned, and the attacks against you, like, I'll just say the Phil Illy thing, I really did see both sides. I mean, there were people saying ridiculous things on both sides as well that I didn't agree with, but there were good points on both sides too.
Mm-hmm,
Um and
mm-hmm.
and just to be like transparent, I did personally have kind of a negative reaction to him. Not even just the picture, but when I clicked through to his profile from the picture, from the tag, his tag in the picture, and then I sort of perused his Twitter account and his whole thing. That's what kind of put me off of him, was his
Mm-hmm,
ideology that autogynephilia is a sexual orientation. That kind of made me not
mm-hmm.
so disposed to be in his favor. But that was a very different scandal than all the attacks against you, which were just so horrible. I mean, like, so upsetting, so stupid. Can I just say that? Like, so
It was
banal,
so stupid.
so
Yeah.
dumb, so brain dead. And it just really felt like there were no good arguments there. It really just felt like people on Twitter, like, drinking or smoking or something, or just late at night on their keyboards, just being douchebags and going crazy, just saying that, like, basically they just didn't want a gay man speaking in this arena at all. And have you, yeah, so have your feelings around the GC world, the gender critical world, the, opposition to trans ideology, has that changed at all? Or, like, how do you feel within that now?
Well, I feel like the sort of war was important enough not to just sort of quietly slink away and to hold on to my principles that I care about women's rights as well as gay people's rights. And I tried to stay out of all of that mess by and large. And for the most part, I think most people even a lot of people who attacked me, are just trying to pretend it never happened now. I'm not exactly getting
Wow.
letters of apology in the mail, but
Yeah.
I'm just getting people trying to pretend it never happened. Um, and to them, I say, fuck you. It happens, Where's the apology? The very public one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I did nothing, I said something stupid and promptly apologized for it. But I had a point that I was trying to make, even though I said it stupidly, that even if you disagreed with me, you don't accuse me of being a child molester for disagreeing with me.
Yeah.
There was
And I
just
don't
so much
remember what it
homophobia
was,
within it.
Artie. I don't remember what the
Oh,
original
I
point.
talk about ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and there was this ancient Roman couple, and one of them was like, by modern standards, like in his late teens, and that was like people went up in arms that I was a child molester. It was awful. It was just totally ridiculous, just completely decontextualizing gay history, decontextualizing Roman history. It just is like
Yeah.
it's not humanly possible for a gay person to be interested in some of the very few gay figures in all of human history, because there's only like five of them,
Mm.
unless he's secretly a child molester, and it was just horrific,
God. Yeah.
um, that was particularly painful because my mother was still alive at the time, and she was seeing all of it, and she was starting to like get upset and wonder if I was a child molester, and that was just so painful, you
I'm so
know.
sorry. That is
And
disgusting
when
that
she
they did
finally
that.
died last year, it was very tragic and I was very sad. But there was a sense of like, at least they can't hurt her and they can't hurt me through her, because she would, if there was any more attacks like that, she wouldn't see it. She wouldn't have to bear witness to it. So, you know. So,
Yeah.
but I hold strong too. There are a lot of, very passionate, ardent, radical feminists who are active in this, who have been supportive of me all along. And I still have very strong connections with them, and I'm very happy about that. But I've shifted a little bit more of my focus on gay men's rights specifically in this issue. Um, because it's needed more than ever. Because there's a lot of abandoning of gay men's rights from a lot of the other aspects of this movement. So I'm putting a lot more focus on gender nonconforming males specifically because males who are gender nonconforming are getting attacked and starting to get beat up on all sides, and that's not good. It's really important that we not do that. And that isn't to say that I've turned my back on feminists and on women's rights activists, because I'm very strongly in allegiance with them. I was raised by a feminist, and I'll never not have feminist allegiance in my heart. But it's just there's just on Twitter. There's been a lot of hostility from some small factions. And we should always clarify, we're talking about a small number of people. So if you're listening to this and getting your back up and thinking I'm talking about you, I'm probably not. I'm talking about the more extremist people. Not
Yeah.
all, yeah.
Yeah, those people who are basically just the equivalent of TRAs who are just want to cancel, just want to, and they don't want to put themselves out there. They're most usually anonymous trolls, and they really do fit that stereotype of just being a keyboard warrior.
Yeah,
So,
but I mean, a lot of that's social media's, the problem with social media is it gets people very riled up.
yeah.
And it encourages people to lash out. There's no cost and high, so, I have a hard time, except for a few specific individuals who have done some very specifically bad things. I just have a hard time blaming people for this. I just feel like it's like, okay, you were really mean on Twitter last night or whatever, but Twitter is the problem and not really you at the end
I
of the
don't,
day.
Artie. I don't have a hard time blaming them. I blame them. I blame them so much. And it reminds me it reminds me of like when I first got canceled and I was 25, and people always say like, well, a lot of these trans supporters, they're so young, they don't know. No, no, no. I don't give them any excuses. But it's very
Fair.
it's charitable that you do. And I mean, I just think that another thing is the anonymous people on Twitter, they want to have a say in how people who do have their face up can say things, and it's like, that's not how it works here. You can comment and you can say what you think, but you can't tell us what to say since we're actually speaking out with our faces attached to it. That's just a ridiculous expectation that a lot of them have. It's an unrealistic expectation.
And often they don't, even anonymously, they don't have opinions. A lot of these TRAs, they will attack you for having an opinion and having your face attached to your opinion. But they don't even, not only are they anonymous, they don't hold an opposing opinion. They just attack your opinion, So,
Yeah.
trans women or men? Okay. Do you agree or disagree? They don't tell you, Or the famous Stanilin question. Don't you just love Helen Stanilin's question? Like, male-born person with a penis in a women's changing area. They will attack Helen for saying, no, I don't think a male-born person with a penis should be allowed to use the women's changing area. But then Helen will ask them, okay, well, what's your view? Yes or no? Or
Right.
maybe. Like, give me your answer. And they just explode with rage, and they never
Yeah.
answer. So
Yeah.
their TRAs are happy to attack you for staking a position, but they don't want to put their cards on the table. And that's a really frustrating thing. A lot of people, they don't actually know what's going on, and they don't know how to decide for themselves where they stand. But they're sure getting their rocks off attacking other people for actually having the guts to try to venture an opinion. And we need people to venture opinions so that we can debate our differing opinions, So we need everybody to actually step up and speak their mind and try to think of where they come down on these questions instead of just attacking people who dare to venture an opinion, Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. You have to try to have these conversations, even if you mess it up. You have to try to break down why the trans rights activists are wrong, even if you make missteps. And that's another thing about like Gen Spect and their conference, and Stella O'Malley, who does incredible, amazing work. And she's such a talented and honestly really special individual. And But of course, the GenSpect as an organization, they might make mistakes in what they say or what they do, but that's okay. But for people just sitting on the side, kind of throwing stones, it's like, so do you never want any of this to go anywhere? And another thing that I'll put to you and like get your take on this, Sal Grover said to me in my last conversation with her, she said, I really want women to get in the mindset. She did say specifically women, but it applies to anyone. To get in the mindset of what's our next battle going to be? What's kind of like the affirmative battle going to be? Because this is all contradicting or like, a negative thing against something that exists, whereas it's not putting something new into the world. So she's talking about that whole concept of the careerism where you just get stuck on an issue and you don't actually want to fix it because now your whole identity is staked on that issue existing and being like in opposition to that one issue.
Oh my God, that's brilliant, a brilliant insight of Sal's, and it's so true in so many ways. Like I've been using this word adjudicate so much lately, but like we have to adjudicate that some things are wrong, and then we have to aggressively move beyond them. You can't just stay in the argument, or the argument will go on forever. Some arguments need to be put to bed, and sometimes you have to use strategy to put them to bed. You have to sort of act as though, like, in pool, billiards for the British, you have to think multiple moves ahead. You're not thinking about getting the whole ball into the hole. You're thinking about getting that ball into the hole, and then where's the cue ball going to land on the table to get it where you want it to go for the next ball. That's how you get good at pool. You're not just trying to get the ball in the hole. You have to be so good at that that you need to get the cue ball to land where it is to think about the next move. And then you have to be good enough to be able to think about 3 moves ahead. Same with chess. You have to be thinking like, we already know what our immediate goals are. We have to start aggressively pushing past them. Yeah, and speaking as though we've already won the argument and offering what the discussion is going to look like when we have won the argument. If we start making that conversation, making that space, I think people will just naturally start to understand that this argument is done and dusted. Issues can't live on forever. I've been thinking a lot about the sort of the free marketplace of ideas and how it just doesn't work in the information age. We can't just allow everyone to say anything anywhere. There's a threshold of discussion, and we should make sure that that threshold is as wide as possible. I'm a free speech absolutist in terms of the law, but I'm not a free speech absolutist in terms of we live in a trust network system. We are tribal primates. We need to make sure that there are people, we can build up trustworthy people who have views and opinions that we can trust are aligned with our values and that we can align ourselves with. Like, this has always been the problem, that if you're on the left, you don't just adjudicate every single issue. You buy the package, right? And that package was generally in line with your views. Pretty much everything within the left-wing package or the right-wing package was in line with your views. Okay, abortion, freedom for abortion, gay rights, less racism. Everything seems to work within the package, right? Now that whole trust is gone, and now we have to go through every single issue and decide whether we agree with it or not. But most people can't do that because they don't have the time. And what that means is they just abandon the package of the left for the package of the right, or for the package of like the kind of heterodox, which is a kind of alternative middle ground package. So the idea that we can just, everyone will just make up their mind about everything, it's just not how the human brain works. We actually do need to sort of establish that there are high reputation views and opinions and low reputation views. And we have to establish a kind of hierarchy of trustworthy people. It's ugly because in the sense that it's not idealistic, in the sense that it's conceding that most people don't make up their own minds about most issues. They just find someone they like who has a strong reputation and attach themselves to that person. But that's how the human brain works. And we can't fight that human brain instinct by just letting everybody decide everything all the time. We have to build networks of authoritative figures who have earned trust, who can tell the busy people, no, trans women aren't women, you know. No, that's not in your value system, you know. In the information and internet age, I think that whole trust network has fallen apart. Um, Sort of papers of record like the New York Times, which position themselves as those adjudicators, as the people who were working to uphold the sort of rational, reasonable, progressive truth, to use that word progressive that I'm a little iffy on these days. Um, they've lost all their trust. You know, they've lost their trust because of this issue and because of other things. But that doesn't mean that there should just never be any trust networks anymore. I don't know if I made that point very clearly because I'm just kind of winging it right now. But did you just get the gist of what I'm saying? That we can't pretend that we live in sort of a sort of libertarian free market of ideas entirely, because human beings are irrational actors, and we do have to rely on these shortcut heuristic tools that have to do with trust and shame. We have to shame the bad views and build trust around the good ones, and we can't just let everyone make up their minds all the time, because the bad actors will take advantage of that, and that's what we're seeing in the US. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, that's kind of a new concept to me, so I'm still absorbing it because it's definitely something that I learned when I got canceled, that we really just accept this package of beliefs. I mean, I was kind of aware of it before because I was someone who was like pro Green Party, which in the United States is the most fringe of fringe. But so I was already aware of critical that people who were on the left broadly, which I was at that time and I'm not anymore, were just sort of accepting this package of ideals. But what you're saying about going beyond it, that is so tricky because so when I got canceled, I reevaluated so many different issues that I had taken for granted before. And that was an interesting process. But like you said, most people just can't do that. And I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been canceled for this one issue, this gender issue. So when we have, I mean, having different leaders in some sort of movement, like you're saying, it makes complete sense. Like, we're not going to be able to change how human beings work. We're just going to have to work within that framework. That makes so much sense. That's very smart. But how do we get to the point where we can have leaders we trust on a variety of issues? I mean, like, one thing that I've noticed, and I don't know your views on this, but one thing I've noticed with a lot of people who are critical of trans ideology, they're not critical of Israel. And it just happens to have become this package thing now where
packages are just reestablished. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something that bothers me a little bit because I do think it will very much go down in history as Israel is in the wrong with what they're doing. The slaughter of civilians is so off the charts. It's so insane. Whatever else you think about all the other aspects of it, like, that alone should be something that people can at least acknowledge as being wrong and not being anti-Semitic to say. So, I mean, that's one thing where I know, like, I'm asking you, like, okay, solve this problem. But are we ever going to get to the point where we have leaders we can trust and, you know, let go of, like, a skepticism?
I don't know. Help us, AI. Please, robot computers, save us from this problem. Like, it's hard to, like, I don't know what the answer is. I do know that, you know, when these very trustworthy, reputable sources like the New York Times and the democratic system, these are all built on these delicate, fragile, they're all built on trust networks that were very fragile and that can't be authoritatively imposed. They have to be built up and earned. And in the information age, all of that's just completely collapsed. And I honestly don't know how to fix it. But I don't want to live in a world where there's no trust networks, because we're already seeing what's happening is that everybody's just building their own private realities. You know, everybody's living in their own separate reality now. And that's bad. So what we've seen is we've just flung open all the information to everyone everywhere, and there's no hierarchy of sources. There's no sort of reputation anymore. Everybody can build their own reputation. And in that world, it's chaos. It's anarchy. It's information anarchy. And it turns out information anarchy doesn't function, doesn't feed democracy very well. We're seeing it's just not working, and we're seeing democracy start to collapse. We're seeing just all of our social fabric starting to collapse, and it's really the information age that's at the end of the day, at the very bottom. If you dig and dig and dig and look at the root of all this, it's too much information all over the place. Nobody knows who to trust. Nobody has any sense of what's real anymore, because we needed some hierarchies to adjudicate that. There's that word again. We needed some people to be able to say, no, cigarettes don't cause cancer. No, vaccines don't cause autism. No, trans women aren't, no, puberty blockers are not reversible. We need people to be able to trust, to adjudicate this. And we need that in democracy too. We need to be able to say, no, Donald Trump is a criminal. That kind of thing. But also, like, Joe Biden's son is a jackass. We need to be able to adjudicate all of this.
Right.
And I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. But I think we have to be leaning into trying to repair our trust networks and not leaning away. We're so angry, like when the New York Times has started getting back into the gender dispute. They published a profile of Jamie Reed. They've been talking about the Cass review. A lot of people are like, too little, too late, fuck you, New York Times. And I understand that reaction. But we actually need something like the New York Times. If not to repair the New York Times as an authoritative, trustworthy voice to adjudicate the truth, then to replace it with something that's just as good. And we can't just live in a world without something like that. We need a very large-scale, massive, popular newspaper that has a strong reputation to get back to adjudicating properly. And the idea that we got stung by it because they adjudicated wrongly on the trans issue, and a lot of us got hurt, we have to figure out, we can't live in a world without any judges, we still need informational judgment, if that makes sense. This is a very contra-libertarian position, but it's not a contra-free speech position. I absolutely believe in, total freedom of speech in terms of the law, but I think we can't be naive about how it works in terms of reputation, and we can say that some views are bad and some views are good. We can even say, and Benjamin Boyce is ringing a bell somewhere, some views are harmful. But we have to be careful, of course, when we do that. We can't go crazy. The sort of woke people became moral absolutists, that they wanted to just completely control all information. They wanted to ban everything that was bad and punish it. That's crazy. But the opposite direction is complete moral relativism, where all views are equally good. And in that world, views never die. Bad views never die if we're not allowed to say that they're bad, and if we're not allowed to banish them from places of high repute. We shouldn't banish them from the law, but they should be relegated to the history books, not the memory hole. If that makes sense.
That's beautiful. I love that quote. It's like preserving history and preserving the bad acts that occurred is so important. The memory of when things went wrong. And
yeah. But
I
we
love
can still say that, like, some views are shit,
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, yeah.
And, like, bringing back shame, potentially, in some aspects, that's another thing that... And, I think that's another thing where some feminists, especially rad femmes, have gone too far, where they're like, okay, bring back shame. But too much shame, maybe, they're doing a little bit. And then also the idea of having to accept that the New York Times, for example, could maybe come back, because it never occurred to me before you said that it could be kind of almost like a naive view to just write them off completely for how bad they got. And I'm not in any way saying that they haven't gotten really bad, because they've fallen to like a zero or less than zero.
Terrible.
But the point you bring up that I didn't think about before is that that's kind of like how it goes. Like, that's just how it goes. That's just to be expected, because why would you think that this could be an infallible institution anyway? So it's just made up of people making their mistakes, and or some bad actors too. And so why couldn't it, I guess, swing back in the other direction instead of just writing them off? Like, I'm pretty quick to sometimes write people off, like I said, with the anonymous commentators, which I stand by that. But yeah, and Arty, you're starting to sound a lot like Jordan Peterson with all this hierarchy and chaos and order.
Wow,
Oh
I didn't know we
yeah.
talked about that stuff. I would have thought he
Well,
would have been a rejecter of all hierarchies. So interesting.
no, and I actually am a fan of Jordan Peterson. However, not and not everything. I don't take him as a package deal, but I like the old school. Yeah, to be very clear on that. But I like the old school Jordan Peterson when he was talking
Mm.
about psychology, and he was a clinical psychologist, and I think he was probably an excellent clinical psychologist from everything I've heard him say about that. But he does talk about how he paints leftists with a broad brush, and he says, oh, leftists just think there's no hierarchies at all, but there always are hierarchies, because everything you do, you're discriminating, you're making a decision, you're always placing one thing above another. So, I
That's
think that's,
exactly true. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then
Wow.
also separating.
The little I've read of Jordan Peterson, I disagree with him more often than I agree with him, but
Mhm.
I'm not afraid to admit that that's a great quote, and I 100% agree with it. But I
Yeah,
don't paint the left with a broad negative brush at all, because
right.
I think good intentions are good.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And another thing that he talks about is like separating order from chaos, and that's a huge theme of his. So that's kind of funny. You and him are like linked up a little bit. But
Wow.
yeah. What was funny was in his book, The 12 Rules for Life, he talks about he basically assigns chaos is the feminine spirit and order is the masculine spirit. So a lot of people got really mad at him for that, of course.
I'm rolling my eyes at that. Like,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
I
And
know.
I
I used
think
to like.
yeah.
There are differences between males and females, and I'm not afraid to. I don't think men are entirely from Mars, and I don't think women are entirely from Venus, but men are in the direction of Mars, and women are in the direction of Venus, generally speaking, with
Mhm.
many, many exceptions and many variations and a lot of
Yeah.
overlap. But I'm not a complete, like, I'm not a, what would you call it? A blank slater, that there's no
Mhm.
difference between males and females, but I also, I bristle at these, like, it sounds like a lot of what Jordan Peterson says is overgeneralizing, and feminists get upset and women get upset when they're being put in a too constricting box. There are a
Mhm.
lot of women who fall into female stereotypes. There are a lot of women who don't like female stereotypes and who don't fall into female stereotypes. And I think when we use language that's too simplifying around that, it's it it irks rightly the people who don't fit into those stereotypes, because they start to deface, within the social fabric, within society, they start to get looked at as in a place where they don't want to be. And that's exactly where, to go right back to what we were talking about earlier, if you're seen by being female and having a female body as naturally being within this region of society, and you don't feel like that's where you're supposed to be, that can lead to gender distress. It can lead to gender dysphoria or body distress, and we don't want that. So that kind of over stereotyping is exactly the kernel that leads to gender dysphoria and the transgender crisis to begin with. So yeah, you know what
Mhm.
I mean? So maybe that's the
Yeah.
point where I strongly disagree with Jordan Peterson, because I think a lot of these people who lean heavily into the sex differences, they go too far into that direction. And this is exactly what makes people feel constrained, and what makes other people discriminate against people who don't fit the boxes, and it causes all the problems. So many of the solutions have to do with balance. Like, shame is good in some amount, but there's such a thing as too much. It can be frustrating, because the answers to all of these problems are often not no shame or all shame, but some kind of shade in the middle, which can be a little bit frustrating, because we're not
Yeah.
saying like something's 100% good or something's 100% bad. It's just
Right.
there's always a balance, and that can be annoying, especially for viewers who want like um, spicy takes when they go to YouTube to watch videos, because that's not
Yeah.
a very spicy answer. It's like actually nuance and balance.
Mhm.
It's usually the answer, and it's not spicy, but it's true.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like a little drop of shame, is better than a whole ocean of shame, because even when you look at like a personal, if you're trying to self improve on a personal level, you might want to use a little eyedropper full of shame just to kind of like be self-aware, like where did I go wrong? Where do I hold responsibility for the issues in my life? But then you don't want to wallow in that, because that turns into its own kind of narcissism and just spinning your wheels. So I could see where there's, with a very light touch, almost like a little bit of the poison is the remedy sometimes. I think that's like something from medicine.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly. I think
Yeah.
maybe I heard Jordan Peterson say that one time. But
But if we go too far with that, and
and
we get
then
homeopathy, so we don't want to go there either.
right, you go too far with that and you're just like using crystals and stuff. But and nothing else. But another controversy that I was just reminded of is, so do you know Peter Boghossian and his street epistemology series? Are you familiar with that at all?
A little bit. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just a little bit familiar with it. I know who he is, but I've never met him, and I've never really delved too far into his stuff. But yeah.
Okay, so he has this series that I think is really cool, the street epistemology series, where he goes around to college campuses or just on the street and he talks to people about very controversial issues, but he has them stand on different parts of a spectrum, like strongly disagree all the way over to strongly agree. And he'll put a statement out like sex is binary or something like that. Then what he'll do that I think is so cool is the people who are standing on the different spaces, they won't just say why they're standing there. They will be asked to say, why do you think that person is standing over there? What do
Ooh, I
you
like
think
this.
his strongest argument is? What do you think, why do you think she's standing over there? What makes her believe that? Or they'll have to switch and argue the other side. Or he'll ask them, what would it take? What evidence would you have to see to make you move over here? So it's very educational for them. It's like the Socratic method. He is a professor, so that makes sense. He's good at making people think. And then it's very educational for the viewers as well, because you can see how people got to literally how they got to the physical point where they're standing at.
That's
He,
amazing. And it also
mm-hmm.
it shows how people are often choosing their own positions relative to everyone else. They're looking at a crowd
Ooh,
and saying,
yeah,
I like to be in the middle, or, oh, I like to be on the spicy extreme because I'm an activist, or
great
I like to
point.
be on the conservative side. And like,
Mm-hmm.
people are always positioning themselves the Overton window. Yeah, like, that's amazing. I want to watch that. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really cool. So I'll send you the link, but it's, yeah, easily found. Street Epistemology, Peter Boghossian. So, but he did have, I thought, a very wrong take. He interviewed Kara Dansky, radical feminist lawyer. She's an American, and she is working on the gender issue, tackling the issue of men invading women's safe same-sex spaces and things like that. So he asked her about the threat of male violence. And she said that women are kind of always under this threat of male violence. And then his response to that was, well, then why aren't you constantly arming yourself? Why aren't you
Hmm.
learning how to fight back against men? And what it really boiled down to, for some reason, this is what their discussion boiled down to, was that women should learn to fight back against men if they see them as a real threat. And I felt like it was so strange because I was seeing this very anti-woke guy, Peter Boghossian, suddenly sounding so woke because he was saying that if a woman is a black belt, that she could take on a male attacker. And that sounded to me just like the trans activists who say that sports can be mixed because women just need to train harder.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, what do you think of that whole debate of like, but it also connects to, there's the specifics of that debate, but it also connects to what you're saying about people going into these weird camps, like where would he even say that if he wasn't being contrary to this radical feminist position? I
Mm-hmm.
don't know.
Right, right. Like, yeah. You know what? It makes I find myself thinking about this more and more and more, just constantly obsessing over the idea that we are the reality, the material reality of our condition. Human beings are primates. We're apes and we're tribal apes, and we have very limited brain functions. And there's this old metaphorical view of the human mind that's outdated in terms of neuroscience, but it's very useful as a kind of thinking exercise. And it goes like this. There's the lower brain and the higher brain. So the outermost layer of the human brain is the cerebral cortex. And this is where humans do all of our abstract reasoning. This is what separates us from all the other animals, all the other mammals, is that we have these gargantuan cerebral cortexes, which we can use to do things like create complex language, complex reasoning skills, massive amounts of empathy. All of civilization is a bunch of human cerebral cortexes interacting with each other, creating a kind of metaphorical world that's filled with ideas and concepts that we navigate and negotiate. And that's what we call civilization. There's a great quote from the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who just died a month or two ago, something along those lines, that we live in a brain collective where we all are just exchanging concepts through language with each other and living in this plane of conceptual data. And of course, on the internet, that's hyperly true. But all of that is sitting on top of our mammalian brains, our lower brains, which are still very animal-like, which were evolved to live in the natural world, in the jungle, so to speak. So we have deeply tribalistic instincts. There are differences between males and females, between our physical mammalian bodies. And just, I think it really helps us to constantly remember that our whole civilization is just a thin veneer of conceptual information exchange on top of our mammalian bodies and our mammalian brains as well. I just think we need to constantly remember that we can't live in these perfect abstract worlds that we metaphorically construct through our minds, because we are living in very flawed mammalian bodies. So when Peter Boghossian says, it says that women should just defend themselves, it sounds like he forgot that we're mammals and female mammals are smaller and weaker by and large than male mammals, and there are instinctual material reasons that we can't overcome through abstract reasoning and conceptualizing that women should be, much more afraid than men. And this has to do with sexuality, with gender expression. A lot of this stuff has to do with our material mammalian bodies and our primate brains, our paleo-mammalian brains, as opposed to our cerebral cortex reasoning brains. And it feels like trans ideology, for example, is like entirely conceptual and completely forgets the physical body. There's no such thing as sex drive that discriminates against males and females. There's no such thing as a male and female body, or even a male. Like, they're just thrown away the material part of the human existence, and they're just living on that abstract conceptual layer. And that's a mistake. We have to always remember that we're living in two worlds at the same time. The cerebral cortex, abstract conceptual world, and also the primate mammalian world. We're always mammals at the same time that we're thinking animals. And we can't forget both. And I just feel like that way of thinking has, in my mind, solved so many problems. I use that way of thinking when I'm dealing with political extremism, when I'm reading about Trumpists or wokeists. I'm thinking about mammalian tribalistic minds becoming frightened because there's too much information in the conceptual sphere. When I think about sexism, I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of that too. Yeah, it's just kind of like, to me, it's been very revolutionary to just constantly ground myself in this. I'm living in a primate world with just a thin veneer of culture on top of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, it also reminds me of what we were talking about before in terms of gender roles, like how it kind of shakes out. And I think a lot of the stereotypes about how women act and how men act, the ones that are kind of what I've seen in my life anecdotally and just people around me, it seems like the ones that are true, the stereotypes that are true, just kind of exist naturally. That's just kind of the instincts that we gravitate towards, whether it's what profession you do or just how you act, how you dress, how your values, your interests, and whether you're, more nurturing or more whatever it is.
And we can't fight it. So this is like the extremists of the sort of the people who throw away the blank slate. That line of feminism that says that women aren't more nurturing than men and that kind of thing. That's totally, they're ignoring the primate mammalian base part of the human experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I've been seeing it. So.
And there's a reason for that, though. It's complicated because we have such huge cerebral cortexes. We forget that we have any primate mammalian relics in our lives at all a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
We start to think that we just live in the conceptual civilized world, but like no, we don't. And as we move into the sort of high-tech AI transhumanist age, we're going to really cling to those human differences because we're going to cherish them because those are going to be the things that make us special as a species and not like those ugly, cold AI robots that are going to be taking over everything. So
Yes,
we're going to lean into a
exactly.
lot of those kind of things more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I hope so. I mean, I think that also really brings us to the issue of gender dysphoria because people who are suffering from the severe alienation from their body, they are so up in their brains thinking about how can I fix this issue. And here's another thing I'll put to you, this idea that I've been having lately. I think that from a lot of what I've learned about how people react to trauma or how they feel when they want to jump out of their own skin. What I've learned is that it really is a physical problem that has to be solved within the body. And so I've started to think, a lot of the gender critical people who just advocate therapy, therapy, therapy for people with gender distress, I think they are missing the mark. I think when, for example, teens who say, I can't stand my body, I need to change it, I don't necessarily think they're way off when they say, hey, this is a physical problem that I'm having and it might need a physical solution. I just don't think the physical solution is medical transition or surgeries or all those things. It might be more things like exercises where you can feel more comfortable and grounded in your body and feel more connected, like you're saying, to the mammalian side of us where it's like, this is my body is me and all that stuff where I really exist within it. I can't escape. We can't escape that. But what do you think about that in terms of just like the the solution to severe distress when that people have with their sexed bodies? Like how do you see that as do you see that as something people can resolve in some cases and how?
Well, I think that I'm always sympathetic when people are experiencing distress about this. Like, never tell a child or a young person who's distressed about their gender expression or their body that gender doesn't exist. Because you're telling them, like, shut up, get over it, saying, oh, gender exists to you, gender matters so much to you that you're in profound distress over it. Don't just dismiss that, lean into what's going on with them. And, I had a conversation with Buck Angel, who is a trans identifying female, a few months ago on YouTube, and it was a really great conversation. And there was just a little subtle moment when the term internalized homophobia popped up. And Buck kind of had a moment like, I hate that term because it's so inaccurate. And that little moment opened up a kind of whole landscape to me that a lot of people who are experiencing this distress around their bodies or around their gender expression, they don't like the idea that they're internalizing something because it's putting the onus of blame on them when it's really the society. When you meet people who have undergone transition, it's that their family members weren't accepting them. They were living in a religious conservative community they were scared to be gay. They're living in Poland and they face it's the social environment that causes distress to them. And yes, technically they are internalizing it, but sometimes the word internalized implies that it's their fault. And we really have to take the idea of fault out of the equation at all. So if somebody's experiencing body distress, I think you're quite right. We should work on their body distress. We should meet them where they are. And there's nothing wrong with that. And yes, I love your idea that they should be doing exercises with their body. I had a talk years ago with Coach Blade, Linda Blade. Do you know who Coach Blade is? She's
Yeah, yeah.
wonderful. She's a Canadian advocate for sport. She really taught me the importance of sport in a real philosophical sense, that it connects women to their bodies in an amazing way, and it makes women feel so empowered. But even on a social level, sport is really interesting because it takes a lot of that paleo, mammalian, primate, human instinct and puts it in a safe place to work stuff out. We're also warrior mammals. We're a very bloody, violent mammalian species. You know, we're one of the most murderous animals. I think chimpanzees are also very violent. They get into wars, but we war like crazy. So sport is really interesting because it helps us channel tribalism and war and fighting and combat in a low stakes, symbolic way. Games are wars, but they're wars where no one dies or gets, seriously injured. Sports teams are tribes, but they're tribes that have low stakes. You can just root for your team and buy a t-shirt and wear a hat, and you're not sort of getting into all these. So there's all these paleo mammalian primal instincts come out through sport. It's so important. And that has a lot to do with the physical body. Engaging with your body, is basically engaging with your whole primate self, and it's connecting the conceptual cultural world we live in with all of its problems that don't fit us into it properly with yourself. So I guess it's a roundabout way of sort of trying to maybe touch on answering your question, but I don't know if that's the most satisfying answer. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so there's also this other issue that I keep running up against every time I interview, a detransitioner or something, where they might be in the camp with the homophobia coming at them and making them almost hate themselves in certain cases, or they could be straight and they could have some kind of trauma that they've gone through, and there's an overlap also. There's a blurring in the middle here. They could be both, but they could be in the camp where, especially with the ROGD girls, a lot of the girls who go through puberty and then want to transition and want to become gay men, right? So they're actually straight girls, and they are not dealing with that. It's not the society at large that's against them for their sexuality. It's something else that's going on with them. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but the sports thing is so apt, and I guess I'm just trying to figure that out, because every time I interview a detransitioner, it's like it's so heartbreaking that this is what they were offered. They were offered these hormones and the surgery, which has now left irrevocable. How do you say that word? Irrevocable.
Yeah.
Thank you. Irrevocable damage. And they weren't offered an alternative. And I think sports is a great idea. I don't know if it's enough necessarily. And then, suddenly you're a girl running track and there's a boy beating everybody. That presents a whole nother problem there too.
Oh yeah, sports. It's all the more reason we need to make sure we protect women's sports, is because they're so important for helping women build that dignity and that connection to their bodies and find their proper space in society on their own terms. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And staying on the sports subject for a second too, it really strikes me whenever I hear this debate going on and the pro-trans side saying, like, just endlessly trying to, this is their idea of nuance, where it's like, well, people have Neil deGrasse Tyson, we have to go by hormone levels and all these other markers. It's not just as simple as black and white, male and female. And it really strikes me that they're arguing something completely different. They're arguing something that society already settled, which is that women should have sports. And if you want to argue that, fine, just be honest that that's what you're arguing about, that you don't think women should have sports. But it doesn't make any sense to be arguing this whole thing about, men can be in the women's category in some fair way. So, if you want to say there shouldn't be women's sports, that's a whole different debate. I mean, our society completely already settled that, but I feel like that's why people get so confused on it, because they don't realize it's completely two different arguments. It's should women have sports is what it really comes down to, but they're masking it as like, well, of course women should have sports. It's just, it's not as simple as male and female and all that.
Any arguments that talk about, like, there's complexity between the difference between men and women, and there's a hazy line in the middle, and it's so big. The Lancet, I think, just made some stupid argument like that. I want to say, if you believe that there's some ambiguity sometimes between who's male and who's female, develop some tests to figure that out, some double-blind tests. Because what they're saying is there's a little bit of ambiguity, and they're just opening the floodgates for anyone to just self-declare whatever they want. And that's the most unscientific thing in the world. If you really think there's There's ambiguity between the line between male and female. If you think that, then figure out exactly what it is. Figure out how we can measure that. Develop a test to say what percent male and what percent female everyone is that can be unambiguously applied. But what they're doing instead is saying, look, there's just some ambiguity, and then therefore everyone can declare whatever they want, and then we have to let them do whatever they want. That's not even scientific at all. And I've seen people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and stuff make those kinds of arguments. Like, sex is complicated. And then there's just an ellipsis and silence. Like, well, if sex is that complicated, figure it the fuck out. And then tell me that some people we thought were male should actually be categorized female. Give me some specific examples of specific people who we thought were male should be allowed into the women's category. Give me some specific fucking tests we can do to determine that and to adjudicate that, whether they have to stay in the male category and the female category. And hormones isn't the fucking answer. So, because hormones doesn't do jack. Hormones don't change the shape of your pelvis, which is vastly different between a male and a female. Hormones don't change the length of your arms, the length of your, they don't change the strength of your bones. They don't change the makeup of your muscles. It's just bullshit. It's total bullshit. This topic makes scientists turn off their science brains and turn on their activist tribal brains instead. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so weird. It's so weird hearing someone like him. Not that he's the most brilliant guy around, Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he is a scientist, right? He's supposedly a scientist. Yeah, and like you said, it's like the edge cases or the ambiguous cases do exist, but they have nothing to do with the men who want to just invade women's sports to cheat and to win. Yeah.
That's exactly so perfectly put. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Totally ridiculous.
Yeah. And okay, I also want to ask you, and maybe to start to wrap up as well, but bringing it back to what we first talked about when we first started. For you, and this is something I've always been curious about with you. I feel like I've never asked you about this. What was it like when you first did talk about this 4 years ago? How scary was that? What did that take for you? I mean, what was that like for you? When you first made your videos, what did that first plunge feel like?
Well, I was already in a sort of dire state about this issue. Because before I took to YouTube to start venting about it, I was talking about it with people in the real world, and I was finding that I was getting alienated from people for talking about it. So it was really scary to go online to start talking about it, but it was the only outlet I had because I couldn't talk about it in the real world anymore. So in a sense, it was almost an element of therapy. I was just like, I'm so angry about this issue. I have so much frustration, and I can't talk about it with any of my friends because they're telling me I'm a transphobic bigot for having these views. So I literally had a bunch of glasses of wine, turned on my camera, and just started yelling at the camera about it or politely discussing it with the camera, just almost as a self-therapy thing. And then I posted it up on YouTube, and I thought no one would see it. But things snowballed rather quickly, and it turned out. And then COVID happened, and it was like, okay, let's go all in. Let's start talking about this online. It was very, very scary, but it was necessary. I was terrified because, again, I said this earlier in our chat, that I don't naturally have a contrarian personality. I don't naturally gravitate towards controversy, but I do naturally speak my mind, and I'm never afraid to say something when something's wrong, when I see that something's wrong and there's danger. But it was really scary because I don't want to lose my friends. I'm in a precarious position financially. I don't have a family to lean on. I don't have savings. And I worked in the gay community and I work in the arts community, and I've lost all of those networks. So I was not in a very good position to start talking about this online because you really need to be secure. You really need to have a strong family network, a strong social network, a strong financial background. You have to have all this stuff locked down if you want to talk about this in the public sphere. And unfortunately, in my case, I didn't have any of that locked down. I have no family My friends, I have friends, but a lot of my friends were way too activisty, and my work was way too connected to the fields that were infected with this problem. So it was a bad idea in terms of my personal situation when I started speaking up about it, and it's been really, really difficult on my personal life. Um, but I wouldn't do it any other way. You know, people talk about. I don't regret it, and and I wouldn't. And if I could go back, I would do it exactly the same again. I would do it exactly the same again because I feel like it has to be done. We have to talk. There are so few of us who have the personal experience that we can share to help people understand what's going on, and who have taken the time to try to understand the issue. And I feel like in my case, because I had gender dysphoria in my childhood, because I had worked in a trans bar, because I had known trans people who had died by suicide and also murder, like because I had seen all the problems firsthand, I had to share that with the world because it's a valuable piece to help people figure out what's going on, you know? Scary as it is, it just felt like, you know, this is a responsibility we have to step up to, even if it costs us our jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that, has it changed? I mean, you mentioned it's tentatively changing a little bit now. Like, tell us more about that.
Well, because I'm not above pettiness, I can't wait till this. I imagine a future when we all figure out this was a disaster, and I can. There are some specific people who did me really wrong that I want to call out for their bullshit. You
Mm.
know, so I have
Mm-hmm.
fantasies about calling out some people specifically.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not above that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just glad to see it starting to find a resolution. And it's really interesting the ways in which it's starting to find a resolution within the gay community specifically. Like transgender, transsexual, and gender nonconforming, they're always going to be in some way connected to same sex attraction. So I may be the co-founder of LGB Alliance Canada, and I advocate for the rights of same-sex attracted people exclusively, but I'm not naive to think that we're just never going to be closely linked to the T in some ways, because historically that's just been a thing that's always been there. We can never live in a world where the T is ever going to disappear, and we always will be working alongside them. Um, it's been interesting seeing that come to the table more and more. I just did an interview with a great Canadian on the LGB Alliance Canada channel on YouTube, a man named Sky Gilbert, who is a famous playwright and author and theater director from Canada, who had been brutally canceled from the theater that he had founded a few years ago. And now he's speaking up about the gender issue. And this is somebody, he's an older gay Canadian who's always been surrounded by transsexuals and transgender people, who most of his friends are transsexual and transgender. Not most, that's a lie, but many of his closest, dearest friends. So for him to be engaging in this conversation from the very heart of like the ultra queer trans part of the gay community is really, really, really interesting. Very lot of perspective from some old school transsexuals who are very cautious about this. Um, and the sense I get is that everybody is realizing that a reckoning is coming. That like we have to start welcoming the gender critical position, for lack of a better term. We have to start being a little bit more science oriented and a little bit more reasonable about how transgenderism relates to gender nonconformity. And there's going to be some concessions from transsexuals, and they're starting to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's good, and I think we'll eventually get there. It might take a long time. You know, it might take a really long time, especially for like the medical institutions, because they have gone so far and there are so many careers at stake now.
Yeah, but I think
And mm,
weirdly, I think some of the medical institutions will be the fastest to fall because of
mm,
litigation and because of
okay.
liability.
Mm,
So that one might
yeah.
be, it might be the one that actually switches off like a light bulb
Hmm.
because of medical liability. So we'll see.
Okay.
That's just a
That's it.
possibility.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting take. That would be good. I hope that happens. That might be the case too, you know, with maybe it will just switch off like a light, like you said, because if it just becomes completely untenable, you know, the reasons that they do it in the first place, like money, career advancement, social standing, if those all just get taken away, yeah,
The fall of
maybe it will.
dominoes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know. Yeah, some there could be some trigger event that just causes all the hospitals to just cut all the funding for pediatric gender medicine, for example. A major lawsuit, like if there's a major win that exposes that everybody's liable,
Yeah.
it could snap shut, you know.
Yeah.
That would
That
leave
is
the
true.
patients, the people who are culturally invested in their transgender identities and who are culturally invested in medicalizing their bodies and have already
Hmm.
done so. That's, I think, going to be the much more complicated, challenging issue. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Like how do we even treat them? How do we even take care of them? Um,
Yeah.
so what would you say, Artie, to the people who wronged you, your fantasies of like getting to do smackdown on them? What would you say to them?
I would say, how dare you? If you imagine yourself as a decent person on the side of good and on the right side of history, you didn't read your history books because you did all the things that all the bad people in all the past crises did. All the unthinking people who went along with all the great injustices in the world, who thought they were doing good, you are like them. And don't you ever forget it until the day that you die. You had it, this was your big moral test in society. This was the big issue where you have to be an upstander and speak up and say that something's wrong. And not only did you keep your head down and not say anything, you actively sided with the wrong people, with the people who were doing harm, and you turned off your critical thinking capacity and you went along with it. And there's going to be great shame that's going to follow you to the grave because of that. That's what I say to them.
That was beautiful. That was amazing. I want to clip that and just put that as its own clip. And yeah, I think that was, and you know, also that reminds me of something that you guys recently said on the mess we're in, where you said, like the people who say, you know, well, I can't lose my job over this. What would you be willing to lose your job over? You know, and that's
Mm-hmm.
an extreme case, losing your job, but it happens. It happened to us. And so what would you like? I recently had a comment on my YouTube channel on one of the detransitioner interviews, and I get this comment, I get a lot in different varieties. You know, surgeons, totally untrue about surgeons, but maybe true about therapists, who go against this and try to tell a patient that they don't affirm them, they'll be canceled, they'll lose their job. And I say it's untrue about surgeons because to be a gender, quote unquote, gender affirming surgeon, you have to specifically choose that path. It's not like you're a therapist who someone just comes to you and you're not really sure what this is. But they say, well, then you'll just lose your job. So you have no choice but to go along with it. And so I think to that, well, you have no choice. So your choice, you think it's a better choice to keep your career, but to send people down a path of destruction of their bodies and their lives, and that's an excuse for you, is that you would have lost your career? I mean, and then another question for you. This is a really hard one. This is not something we can answer because it's hypothetical. But do you think maybe on the other hand, it might be better to lose everything when you have not that much to lose? I mean, I think it might inhibit people from speaking out when, because you're absolutely right. You need to have financial security if you want free speech in this in my country and in Canada and other places too.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that and you just fall, it's almost like you're maybe more willing to fall. I mean, do you think? Like,
That was my
it,
case, I think, and
yeah.
I was probably like, yeah, it's not the first time I've sort of, I'm a tough cookie. I know how to handle, job loss and things like that, or I have in the past. So, but no, like therapists, people, somebody said something in a private channel I was on. There's somebody in a position of authority about this specific issue who was saying, I don't want to stick my neck out though, or I'm scared to. And in my private chat, I was saying, that's what your neck is for. If you take on a career to help to be in the medical profession, that is what your neck is for. It is your job. If you're a therapist, your job is to help people. You're not there to make a paycheck. You're there to help people. So you cannot choose your paycheck over the well-being of your patients, or you're in the wrong goddamn field, because that's what your neck is for. And if you're a politician who has like a pro what do you call it, a portfolio in medicine, you're a politician. You're elected to represent the people and to help the people. It's your job to stick your neck out when people aren't being helped medically. You have no excuse to choose your own, political career or your financial future or your job career over the well-being of patients if you are in any kind of medical authority whatsoever. There is no excuse. That's not the same thing as just being an accountant who works in an office where things have gotten woke and if you speak up, you'll lose your job. It's not the same thing as just being a bartender at a gay bar that has a lot of trans clients. And if you say too much, it'll alienate the customers. Like, it's not the same thing. If you are in the medical field, you have a responsibility. You have a duty. It's that kind of career comes with responsibilities and duties. So no excuse. Stick your neck out because that's what your neck is for. Yeah.
Yes, I love that. And also, if you work with kids too, if you're a teacher, if you work with kids in any capacity, again, that is what you're there for. And you're not there for yourself. I mean, you are there for yourself too, but I feel like that's also something that we've lost is a connection with our jobs, because so many people, they just do their job for the paycheck. And I don't blame them, because they might have no meaningful connection to their work. They might never get to have any connection with the output that they create. In a way, when I look back on my cancellation, I almost feel like I was saved from that life of a career in a very, I don't know exactly. Maybe I won't get into that because I'm not exactly sure. But I certainly lost a career before it really got off the ground. So I didn't have the experience of losing something that I had built over many years. I just lost the potential of it that I had. So it was, it was different. It was more like, okay, if I'm going to get canceled, this is actually a pretty good time. But rather than further down the line when I have built more and I have more at stake there. But yeah, if you are in one of these jobs where you have a responsibility, you should take that as a positive. That should be a meaningful thing for you. And
so true.
So to put the non-meaningful aspect of it, the paycheck, over the meaningful aspect of it, the responsibility is, it's kind of unforgivable.
Yeah, there are two people specifically who are former friends of mine who were particularly vicious towards me. One of them is a school principal who is actively complicit in this because he keeps his head down. That's how he became a principal. And the other one is a teacher of children with learning disabilities. These are two very specific jobs where you're in the thick of it. And there's a massive dereliction of duty. Children with autism are being harmed by gender medicine. And if you're an elementary teacher of children with autism or who are largely with autism, you should not be pushing gender ideology. You're not just keeping your head down. You're an active participant in the problem. And if you're a school principal in the school system and you're taking a position all for this, you were probably complicit. A lot of things went over your desk that had to do with hiding stuff from parents, for example. Yeah. So these two particular people, I'm very specifically infuriated at because of their dereliction of their responsibility and putting their personal careers above what they should have done. Yeah, reading a lot of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt? I've been reading a lot about justice and human nature and the banality of evil. There's some real universal, shocking stuff that human behavior that we can see playing out in the gender mess. People really not being responsible when they should be. And there will be great shame for them in the future.
Yes. And oh my gosh, maybe our next talk could be all about the banality of evil and how people are just keeping their careers but pushing this evil, just like, well, that's what I have to do. I have to sign this. I have to sign off on this. And
just following orders.
Just following orders. Yep. And the one other thing I was going to say was what you described about being tough enough to land on your feet, to keep going. And it's not just a skill thing. It's also like a mental, emotional toughness too. There is a way to develop that, but you can't, if you don't have it naturally. There's a way to develop it, but the way to develop it is to be challenged, is to suffer, really. So, I don't think I had that prior to getting canceled, right? Like, I didn't have the toughness of just, like, landing back on my feet. I didn't know what I was going to do after being canceled. I was scared that I would never get another job again at all. And my friend Mary Kate Fain, she said once something that stuck with me. She said that she grew up very poor. And she said she's always had the ability to go out and make money in whatever way she needed to. She said, I have scrubbed toilets. I will scrub toilets if I need to make rent. So for people who are listening who are thinking about that, that's what I would say is like, you can develop that toughness, but you can't do it by just continuing to shelter yourself and make excuses for what you're doing in the name of keeping your job.
Yeah, grit is a good not what attribute to develop, but it's a muscle you build. But it's a good one. Watch some more. We live in a world where the media is filled with post-apocalyptic shows like The Walking Dead and The Last of Us. Watch more of those shows and fantasize about how tough you're going to be when the apocalypse comes. You need to learn some grit. You need to scrub some toilets. You need to speak up and challenge yourself because the world's going to go to shit very soon. And you know what? If you lost your job for speaking up, you probably gained a lot of strength that you're going to use in the apocalypse.
There you go. Perfect. I think that is honestly, I just dropped my pen. Sorry if you heard that. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Arty, I feel like I could keep talking to you all day, but I don't want to keep you all day. I wish I could, but let's definitely, if you're down, do another one soon. And we have so much more we can get into.
There's so much. Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait for another one. Regular series. Sasha and Arty.
Oh my gosh. Perfect. Okay, you brought it up. So I didn't want to put you on the spot, but amazing. I love it. I was thinking the exact same thing. So, okay, cool. Let's leave it at that, Arty. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to link to your stuff below, your Substack, your Twitter, YouTube, and to The Mess We're In, which you co-host with Graham Linehan and Helen Stanaland.
Right before you press stop. My Substack, shout out to that. I've been writing more and more. I've been focusing on my writing and not my YouTube channel. There's also the podcast, The Mess We're In, and all that stuff is great. But please check out my Substack because I've been putting a lot of my thoughts and energy into more essays. Thanks.
Excellent. Perfect. Okay, so that will be the first link for people to see. If you go to the description beneath the video, it'll be right there for you to click on. All right. Thanks, Arty. Till next time.